We'll take a closer look now at two songs from the first side of Abbey Road and one song from the very beginning of the second side of Abbey Road, having a chance to see a John song, a Paul song, and a George song. We'll start with George's Here Comes the Sun. We'll move on to Maxwell's Silver Hammer from Paul, and then I Want You, She's So Heavy from John. Here Comes the Sun, as I said before, begins the second side of Abbey Road. When we talk about the second side, you can decide whether you think the big Paul piece really sort of starts after Here Comes the Sun or starts at the beginning of side two with Here Comes the Sun. That's something that we can think about. But nevertheless, Here Comes the Sun, an AABA form, very, from a songwriting point of view, conservative in the sense that it's a very traditional kind of form. There's no sort of experimentation or playing around with form. It's, as we said earlier, it's George Harrison showing that he's fully comfortable in the traditional approaches to pop songwriting, something that John and Paul were comfortable certainly by the time we got to something like A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, or Help. In this particular tune, for guitar players out there, the opening guitar thing on the acoustic guitar is played with the capo in the 7th fret. It turns out that the song is in A, but when you have a capo up there, you're actually playing something that feels like a first position D chord. Now, that may be fine for guitar players who want to learn how to play the tune and all that, but the connection, the reason for pointing that out, is because what's happening on the guitar there is very, very similar to what George was doing in the song If I Needed Someone. So if I had the guitar and if there weren't copyright prohibitions, I could demonstrate for you how very similar the beginning of Here Comes the Sun is, even though it's played on an acoustic 6-string guitar, and then play for you the lick from If I Needed Someone that's played on an electric 12-string guitar with the capo on the 7th fret. You would definitely see that George was pretty much playing with a similar kind of approach in both of those. So there is that connection to the tune. What's interesting on all of these Abbey Road songs, and you hear it really plainly in Here Comes the Sun, is the use of the Moog synthesizer. The Moog synthesizer, what we've come to really sort of expect that these days anybody can have a synthesizer, a digital synthesizer that does stuff, lots of different settings, just at the touch of a button, right? I mean, you hit the button and all of a sudden you've got strings, or you've got synth bass, or whatever you want. But back in those days, a synthesizer looked like one of those old-time telephone switchboards with the different sort of plugins and stuff. And so to get a sound, you had to bring a special person in who would just sort of set the synthesizer up and make a sound. You had to hook the oscillator up to the filter, and the filter up to the amplifier, and the wave envelope generator, and various kinds of things. So that was a real sort of, see, you have one in a studio. You couldn't take it out live. You know, it was basically just a sort of a gigantic thing you could use for recording purposes, but it was brand new. Robert Moog, developing this in Buffalo, just outside of Buffalo, New York, had developed this Moog synthesizer. Other people were doing a similar kind of thing with synthesizer, developed by the name of Buchla. There was also a company named ARP that was sort of getting into the business here. And so you had a lot of different kind of synthesizers, and eventually, in a couple of years, these would become very portable, so that people like Keith Emerson and Rick Wakeman and others like that could take little versions, mini Moogs around, and ARP synthesizers, and have them in a live situation. But here it was this gigantic bank of oscillators, and the Beatles, being the Beatles, were one of the first ones to actually have one of these synthesizers that they could use in their music. And you hear it used a lot in Abbey Road. When you're listening for it, especially, you may not notice it if it's just going along, because it all sounds just, everything just seems to flow. But if you listen for the Moog and think about this is mid 1969, it really is pretty fantastic. So you hear a lot of the use of the Moog synthesizer in this tune, especially at the very beginning, where you hear that falling off sound, that pew on the synthesizer. The lyrics themselves deal with rebirth via a seasons metaphor. So the idea of here comes the sun, the ice is melting, the idea that things have been cold and dead, or like in some sort of state of hibernation or suspended animation, and a force like the sun begins to melt these things so they come back to life. Sounds like spring. Remember, the story is that he wrote it on Eric Clapton's guitar in the first days of spring and all that. But the metaphor here is, I think, broader than that, and it could be a romantic song about a relationship that was once frosty and is now reborn, and there's a new commitment in the relationship. It could be about a rebirth of spirituality, when one comes out of the frozen world of materialism and begins to sort of bask in the sunshine of true spiritual understanding and enlightenment. All these kinds of level of meaning can be taken from this. But the idea that there is probably a bit of a romantic interpretation that could be taken out of it really connects it up with the song Something, which is an unabashedly romantic kind of song, and really makes the song less preachy than some of the other George stuff, where he's really kind of like depending on his commitment to Indian philosophy and different sort of counterculture ideas, and is maybe sort of pushing those a little bit hard. Now he steps back, it's a little bit more poetic. I see that as a real move forward in his songwriting technique and his ability to handle the lyrics in a way that's not as didactic as it has been in some of his, not all of it, but a lot of his other music. We look at Maxwell's Silver Hammer coming from Paul. This is a contrasting verse-chorus form. We've certainly seen plenty of these from Paul during this period. It goes verse-chorus, verse-chorus. There's an instrumental chorus. There's a great chance to hear some Moog synthesizer. There's an interlude, another verse-chorus, and then a coda. Now, this is another one of these Paul story songs, but in the case of this one, it's almost a kind of a tongue-in-cheek story song, because the music seems to be so happy and sing-along, not unlike Yellow Submarine or something like that. You know, let's all sing along about Maxwell's Silver Hammer. But the song is actually about a guy who's a serial killer. He even kills the judge at the trial when he tells him he's guilty, right? He bangs him on the head with the hammer, and everybody laughs, and it's, you know, it's funny. He's killing people. And so there's a kind of an irony and a kind of a detachment here. It's another one of these Paul story songs. We've seen a whole string of them now. Obla Di, Obla Da, remember, about the couple who end up getting married with the children. Yellow Submarine was not exactly a story song, but clearly the connection between Maxwell and the sing-along quality here is a pretty good precursor to that. She's Leaving Home, definitely a story song. Penny Lane, kind of a story song, at least a song that tells about a whole sequence of images having to do with his hometown of Liverpool. Eleanor Rigby, definitely a story song. For No One, another one of those kinds of songs that kind of tells a story of a relationship, although it's not strictly speaking a kind of running narrative. So this song, Maxwell Silver Hammer, really reaches back and connects up with a whole bunch of Paul McCartney material that we've seen going all the way really back to about 1965 or 1966. So we can see that connection there. With John's I Want You, She's So Heavy, we really see John, the John of Revolution number 9, the experimental John Lennon, but now in a less sort of severe and sort of avant-garde kind of thing. Think about how many aspects of this song are really kind of experimental. It's a contrasting verse-chorus form. That part of it, not very experimental. There's an introduction, 2 verses and a chorus, a verse and a chorus, a verse, a chorus, and a coda. Okay, that part of it, relatively conservative. That's the part of it that takes his avant-garde tendencies and puts it into something that's easier for a listener to maybe approach. But check out the minimalist lyrics. Without quoting them, I can tell you that the verse has only a few words in it that aren't repeated. In other words, the same small verse is repeated over and over again. And the chorus has got relatively few words that are just repeated over and over. So the lyrics could not be more minimalist. There's something very avant-garde about the idea of, you know, how can I write a song that just uses the same lyric over and over again, but make it interesting, not ironic or funny or something like that. I mean, really get it to work. And that's what happens with the lyrics here. You hear a strong contrast between the verse section and the chorus. And this strong contrast between sections we can trace back at least to John Lennon's Happiness is a Warm Gun from the White Album, and forward a little bit to George's I Me Mine, which, remember, was recorded after Abbey Road was released in January of 1970. Remember we said about that song how strong the chorus was between the relatively mellow verses and the more sort of rocking choruses. And so we get that kind of thing here, except we get a kind of a bluesy R&B kind of verse juxtaposed with a real kind of heavy guitars kind of chorus. Maybe what's most interesting about this song is the way that it ends. Remember, this song ends side one. And you know, when you're sequencing a record, back in those days, you think about side one and side two. Now it's all on a CD, side one, side two, what does that even mean? Back in those days, you had to go and you had to turn the record over to hear the other side. So the experience of hearing side one should, if you sequence it right, feel like a kind of a coherent sequence that works from end to end. Not unlike planning songs in a set for a live band. You know, you got to make the things work in the right order. So if this is at the end of side one, it's a very dramatic way to end. What happens? They go through that big guitar arpeggio thing that comes from the chorus. You've got all three guys, George, John, and Paul, all playing these distorted sort of guitar arpeggios, and they just play it over and over and over again, longer than it should go, almost like the ending of Hey Jude. It's just this real extended repetition of the same thing. But as they're playing that, they use white noise from the synthesizer. And white noise on the synthesizer is sort of all the frequency ranges kind of blended together, sounds like wind, like this, right? And that starts out barely audible in the mix, and it continues to grow and slowly grow and grow and grow until it threatens to overtake the actual music itself with the sound of this white noise. John Lennon is reported to have sat in the studio, it played out a lot longer than it does actually on the record, and decided that there was, he says, I'm going to tell you where I want the cut, and I want you to cut it there. And so they play out this ending as we hear it on the record, and just at the place where it cuts on the album is the place where John Lennon said in the studio, there. And it goes from this really big, gigantic sound that has been going on in the same way over with the growing noise to absolute silence. What does that do? It draws your attention to the silence itself, right? The idea that you can make such a noise that by immediately cutting it off, you can draw everybody's attention to the silence that follows it is a very avant-garde kind of approach. In fact, the avant-garde composer, American composer John Cage, actually has a piece of music that consists of nothing but the pianist going out, putting the score up on the piano, and sitting there for a prescribed amount of time. And as the pianist is sitting there, of course, the audience begins to fidget, and the whole purpose of Cage's piece is to draw our attention to the other sounds that go on in the auditorium, you know, aside from the music, and to get us to focus on that. In many ways, Lennon is playing with the same idea by building that whole thing up and then cutting it off and making it just end there. Now, a bit of personal trivia. I don't know how many of you followed The Sopranos HBO series, but the end of The Sopranos was extremely controversial because it ends with a very abrupt cut to dark. And I think a lot of us, when we saw it for the first time, thought, my cable just went out. You know, what's wrong? The worst time at the end. I don't know how it ends. Well, that is the way it ended. People say, why did it do that way? Well, to me, David Chase, the guy who produced the show, directed the show, was about the age to have been extremely impressed by Abbey Road. I think the end of The Sopranos, my interpretation only, this will not be on a quiz. The end of The Sopranos is essentially David Chase doing the end of I Want You, She's So Heavy from Abbey Road. I mean, it's a fantastic effect. It drove everybody crazy. So crazy that I think he knew that. He went out of the country when the last episode aired because he just didn't want to hear about it. But nevertheless, I think that especially today, when you look at the sort of 50-something and 60-something people who are involved in the entertainment business, in the art business, it's very difficult to find people who weren't influenced by Beatles music, especially this later Beatles music, especially Abbey Road. And you can find influences popping up all over the place, and I would posit even in the controversial ending of The Sopranos that everybody talked about. Well, maybe I just hear it that way because I'm a Beatles nut. Maybe you do too. Well, let's now turn to side 2, which I'll sort of give my own subtitle, A Longer Day in the Life.